Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be doing things a little differently. Usually we're, looking at, current events and news stories and all that, but today we're going back in time a bit.
Time travel.
Kind of. We're going to be taking a deep dive into some regulatory proposals from 2017, actually.
Ooh.
Yeah, it's for price controls in Abu Dhabi's utility sector.
That's right. We've got both the draft proposals from April 2017 and the final proposals, which came out in November of that year. So we can really see how things evolved, how the different stakeholders were thinking, and what ultimately ended up in the final version.
I'm already intrigued. So we're talking about how the government regulates things like water and electricity, those essential services we all rely on.
Exactly. And it all boils down to this document called Regulatory Control 1, or RC1 for short.
RC1. Okay, got it.
This was set to cover the years 2018 to 2021, and it really lays out the framework for how these utility companies are supposed to operate and how their prices are set.
So we're talking about those network companies, right? The ones who deliver the water and keep the lights on.
Yeah, the big players, ADDC, Transco, and ADSSC.
Okay, so if they're the only ones providing these services, why do they need all this regulation?
Well, you've hit the nail on the head. They're essentially natural monopolies.
Ah, I see.
It wouldn't make sense to have multiple companies competing to lay pipes and wires all over the place. It would be inefficient and chaotic.
And probably super expensive, too.
Exactly. So the government steps in to make sure these companies aren't taking advantage of their position and overcharging consumers.
So it's a balancing act, right?
Exactly. Protecting consumers while also ensuring the companies can invest in infrastructure and keep those services running smoothly.
Okay, so that makes sense. But what was so special about RC1? What were the big changes they were proposing?
One of the most significant changes was around transparency in government funding. Historically, these companies received government subsidies, but the way it was handled wasn't always clear.
So the government was giving them money, but it wasn't entirely clear how that money was being used.
Right? RC1 proposed treating those government funds as equity, like the government becoming a shareholder and demanding a return on their investment.
Interesting. So if the companies made a profit, a portion of that would go back to the government.
Precisely. It was all about accountability and making sure those funds were being used effectively.
I can see how that would be a pretty big shift. Did everyone embrace this idea?
Well, not everyone was thrilled. ADWEA, which is the parent company of these network companies, wasn't entirely on board with this change.
They preferred the old way of doing things.
I think it's safe to say that they liked receiving subsidies without all the strings attached.
But the regulatory body was pushing for greater transparency.
Absolutely. You could really see that tension reflected in the documents.
Ooh, I love a bit of regulatory drama.
And this push for transparency wasn't the only big change on the table. RC1 also proposed a major overhaul in how they handle capital expenditure, those big investments in infrastructure.
Okay, yeah, we touched on that earlier, this whole idea of ex ante review. What's the story there?
So traditionally the way it worked was ex post review, meaning they'd look at spending after the project was completed, like getting your expenses approved after you've already gone on that shopping spree.
Not the most efficient system.
Not really. So RC1 wanted to flip that script and move to ex ante review. So the companies would have to justify their spending plans before they got the green light to start building.
That sounds way more sensible.
Right. It's all about making sure those big investments are justified and properly scrutinized.
But why the sudden change? Was there something wrong with the old way of doing things?
Well, the documents reveal a rather interesting pattern, a history of significant underspending.
Underspending, really?
Yeah. They looked back at previous price control periods, specifically PC4, which covered 2012-2013, and PC5 covering 2014-2015, and found that the companies consistently spent far less than they were allocated for capital expenditure.
Like, how much are we talking here?
Billions of dirhams less.
Wow. So they were given all this money to invest in infrastructure, and they didn't even spend it all.
It's pretty surprising, right?
What was going on there? Was it just poor planning or something else?
It's hard to say for sure. The documents don't really delve into the reasons, but it definitely raises some questions.
Yeah. Was it overly optimistic forecasting? Changing priorities? Or something else entirely?
It's a mystery. But one thing's for sure, this history of underspending probably didn't help build trust between the Bureau and the companies.
Yeah, I can see that.
And remember, all this spending, or lack thereof, has a direct impact on how much those companies are allowed to earn. We're talking about the maximum allowed revenue, or MAR for short.
Right, the MAR, that's the upper limit on their earnings. So how did all this underspending affect the MAR?
Well, if they're consistently spending less than projected, it means the MAR was probably set too high in the past.
Makes sense.
And that's something the Bureau was keen to address in RC1.
So RC1 was all about tightening the reins, demanding greater transparency, and ensuring that future spending is justified and scrutinized up front.
You got it.
Okay, so all this sounds good in theory, but what does it actually mean for the average person in Abu Dhabi?
The million-dollar question.
Right. Are we talking higher utility bills?
Well, that's where things get interesting. The final proposal document actually projected a decrease in the total MAR over the RC1 period.
Wait a minute, a
Yep,
decrease?
by 2021, they estimated the MAR would be lower than the actual MAR in 2016.
So potentially lower utility bills.
Potentially.
I wasn't expecting that. Tell me more.
Of course, it's not a simple equation. Lower MAR doesn't automatically equal lower bills. There are lots of other factors involved, like generation and production costs, overall demand, government subsidies.
Okay, so it's complicated.
It always is. But the fact that they were projecting a lower MAR at least suggests a move towards greater cost control and efficiency.
Right, it shows they're at least thinking about keeping costs down, which is good news for consumers.
Absolutely. And this sets the stage for a deeper dive into the financial nitty-gritty of these proposals. We're talking operating expenses, depreciation, that intriguing concept of weighted average cost of capital, all those factors that ultimately influence how much we pay for water and electricity.
Okay, I'm ready to roll up my sleeves and get into those numbers.
Let's do it.
Okay, so let's break down these financial figures. Where do we even begin with something as complex as utility pricing?
Well, we can start with something pretty straightforward, operating expenditure, or OPEX for short.
OPEX, got it.
This basically covers the day-to-day costs of running those utility companies. Think salaries, maintenance, administration, all the things that keep the water flowing and the lights on.
So like the cost of keeping the engine running even before we factor in any new investments.
Exactly. And we RC1 proposals included detailed projections for each company's OPEX over that 4-year period.
Okay, and what did those projections show?
Well, what's interesting is that for ADC and ADDC, their combined electricity and water OPEX was projected to decrease.
A decrease? That sounds promising. Does that mean they were becoming more efficient?
That seems to be the goal. But it wasn't a uniform trend across all the companies.
Oh.
For instance, Transco's projected OPEX actually increased,
Why was that?
largely because they were taking on a big new project, the Liwa Aquifer Reservoir and Storage Facility.
Ah, so new responsibilities mean higher operating costs?
Exactly. But overall, it seems like there was a push for greater efficiency, at least for some of the companies.
Okay, so they crunched the numbers on OPEX, but what about those big ticket items, the capital expenditure, or CapEx?
Ah, yes, CapEx. That's what real money is. And remember, we're now in the world of ex-ante review, so these proposed CapEx figures represent spending plans that needed to be justified and approved up front.
No more blank checks.
Exactly. So what kind of figures are we talking about here?
Yeah, spill the beans.
Well, for the entire RC1 period, AEDC was looking at roughly AED 2.2 billion for combined electricity and water CapEx. ADDC had about AED 2.3 billion. Transco had the largest chunk at around AED 3.9 billion, and ADSSC was looking at a total of AED 2.1 billion.
Wow. Those are some serious amounts. So how did those companies handle this new ex-ante approach?
I imagine they were scrutinizing their spending plans very carefully.
Makes sense. All right, so we've got OPEX, we've got CAPEX. What's next on this financial roller coaster?
Next up, we have the regulatory asset value, or RAV. Think of it like a giant price tag attached to all the assets these companies use to provide their services.
Okay, so we're talking power plants, pipelines, treatment facilities, the whole shebang.
Precisely. It's all about figuring out what all their stuff is worth, but on a massive scale.
How do you even begin to calculate something like that?
It's a complex process, but the document lays out a clear formula. You start with the previous year's RAV, and then make adjustments based on new capital expenditure assets that have been retired, and this is where it gets interesting adjustments based on the efficiency of past capital spending.
Ah, there's that efficiency factor again. So if they underspend, like we talked about earlier, that comes back to haunt them when calculating the RAV.
Exactly. Those PC4 and PC5 CapEx efficiency reviews we discussed, they revealed significant underspending, which directly impacted the RAV calculations for RC1.
So give me an example.
Well, for example, ADDC's starting RAV for electricity in 2018 was adjusted downwards by almost AED 3 billion compared to the initial calculation using provisional CapEx figures.
Wow, that's a huge adjustment. So past inefficiencies have a real impact even years down the line.
It's a clever way to ensure accountability. But wait, there's more. Depreciation also plays a crucial role in calculating the RAV.
Depreciation, right? So like each year, a portion of those assets' value is essentially written off to reflect wear and tear.
You got it. It's like acknowledging that those power plants and pipelines don't last forever.
Makes sense. But I have a feeling this depreciation calculation wasn't as straightforward as it sounds. Was there some debate around that too?
You always read my mind. The way depreciation was calculated became a point of contention between the Bureau and ADWEA.
Really? How so?
Well, the Bureau proposed removing inflation indexation from the depreciation allowance.
Inflation indexation. Could you explain that a bit?
Sure. Essentially, it means adjusting the depreciation allowance each year to account for inflation. So if inflation is high, the depreciation allowance would be higher, allowing the companies to recover more of their costs. The Bureau argued that depreciation should only cover the cost of replacing the asset itself, not the inflated cost in the future.
Okay, so they were trying to keep things grounded in the actual cost of replacement.
Precisely. But ADWEI wasn't happy about this. They argued that removing inflation indexation would create financial risks and potentially impact their ability to fund future capital replacements.
They had a point there, didn't they?
They did, and they pointed to international best practices, highlighting that similar regulatory regimes in places like the UK and Australia do include inflation indexation in their depreciation calculations.
So it's a classic tug of war, the regulators trying to protect consumers from inflated costs while the companies are fighting to maintain financial stability.
Exactly. It's a delicate balancing act. And speaking of balancing acts, there's another crucial piece of this puzzle we need to discuss, the weighted average cost of capital, or WACC.
The WACC, that sounds intimidating.
It can be a bit daunting, but don't worry, it's not as complicated as it sounds. Think of WACC as the rate of return that utility companies are allowed to earn on their assets.
So it's basically the cost of attracting investment, whether through debt or equity.
You got it. A higher WACC means they can earn more profit, while a lower WACC means lower allowed profits.
So it's another one of those balancing acts, finding a rate that's attractive to investors but not so high that it burdens consumers.
Exactly. And what did the RC1 proposals say about the WACC? Well, the Bureau, after a lot of analysis, proposed a real WACC of 4.2%.
4.2%. Did that number sit well with ADWEA?
Not really. They countered with a significantly higher range between 7.2% and 7.5%. They argued that the Bureau's proposed rate didn't adequately reflect the specific risks and costs of doing business in Abu Dhabi's utility sector.
Interesting. So they were pushing for a WACC almost double what the Bureau proposed. That's a pretty big difference of opinion.
It certainly is. And to support their argument, they even commissioned their own consultants report, which estimated a WACC range of 4.6% to 6.2%. Still lower than their proposed range, but higher than the Bureau's figure.
So another clash of perspectives. Regulators aiming for a lower WACC to protect consumers, while the utility company pushes for a higher rate to ensure profitability. It's a high-stake financial chess match. But hey, let's shift gears for a moment and talk about something a bit more, well, let's say feel-good. Let's talk about those performance incentives designed to encourage efficiency and better customer service.
Now that's a topic I can get excited about. It's not all about numbers. And Financial Tug-of-War's RC1 included a whole section dedicated to encouraging those companies to go above and beyond, not just for their bottom line, but for the benefit of the people they serve.
All right, let's dive into those incentives. What kind of carrots were they dangling in front of these companies to motivate them to up their game? So we were talking about those incentives to reward companies for going the extra mile. What did that look like in practice?
Well, RC1 proposed a pretty comprehensive scheme covering 6 key areas: information availability, security and service quality, sustainability, customer service, and even reputational incentives. It's a pretty holistic approach, trying to cover all the bases.
Okay, break that down for me. What specific actions were they trying to encourage?
Well, under information, it was all about promoting transparency and timely reporting. Meeting deadlines for submitting data meant financial rewards, while delays would lead to penalties, sort of like a no-late homework policy, but with real financial consequences.
Makes sense. Accurate data is essential for effective regulation. What about availability, security, and service quality? Those sounds pretty crucial, especially for essential services.
Absolutely. This category focused on things like maintaining high water quality, ensuring a secure and reliable supply, and minimizing those annoying power outages. They even had specific targets for things like SIDI and SciFi, those metrics that track the frequency and duration of outages.
So basically hit those targets, keep the water clean and the power flowing, and you get rewarded, miss the mark, and, well, there's a price to pay. What about sustainability? Was that part of the picture?
Oh, definitely. Sustainability was a big focus in RC1. They proposed brand new incentives specifically related to demand-side management, or DSM for short.
DSM. Okay. And what is that exactly?
It's all about encouraging consumers to use less water and electricity.
Interesting. So it's not just about the companies being efficient, it's about getting consumers on board too.
Exactly. Think rebates for energy-efficient appliances, educational campaigns about water conservation, those kinds of initiatives.
Smart move. Less consumption means less strain on the system and a lighter environmental footprint. Okay, what about customer service? No one likes being left on hold for hours or dealing with unhelpful representatives, especially when it comes to essential services.
You're reaching to the choir. And RC1 recognized that customer service is a big deal. They proposed a new incentive specifically focused on reducing customer complaints. The faster and more effectively companies address complaints, the better the reward.
So fewer complaints, happier customers, and a financial bonus for the company. Seems like a win-win-win. Okay, so they had these different categories of incentives, but how did they actually calculate the rewards and penalties? Was there a specific formula?
Oh yeah, the document gets pretty specific about that. For most incentives, the reward or penalty was calculated based on the difference between the target performance and the actual performance, multiplied by a specific incentive rate. So the further away they were from the target, the bigger the impact, either positive or negative.
So it's not just a pass-fail system. There's a sliding scale based on how well they perform. Seems fair and transparent enough. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. OPEX, CapEx, RAV, depreciation, those performance incentives. Anything else we need to unpack before we wrap up this deep dive?
Ah, you're right. We left that WACC debate hanging, remember? The Bureau proposed a real WACC of 4.2%, while ADWEA countered with a range of 7.2% to 7.5%. So who won that financial tug-of-war?
Yeah, spill the tea.
Well, despite ADWA's arguments and that consultant's report they commissioned, the Bureau held firm. The final proposal stuck with their initial recommendation of 4.2%.
Wow, they didn't budge at all. It seems like they were pretty committed to that lower rate. What was their reasoning?
They basically reiterated their focus on affordability for consumers, arguing that a lower WACC was essential to keeping those utility bills in check. They acknowledged it might mean lower profits for the companies, but they emphasized that it would ultimately benefit consumers and was still in line with international best practices.
It's a tough call, trying to balance the needs of consumers with the financial realities of these companies, but it seems like they prioritized affordability above all else. So there you have it, folks. We've gone deep into those 2017 price control proposals for Abu Dhabi's utility sector. We've seen the push and pull between regulators and utilities, the complex financial calculations, and those clever performance incentives designed to drive efficiency and improve services.
It's been quite the journey. What really stands out to me is the level of detail and transparency in these documents. We've seen the data, the arguments, the compromises, and the final decisions. It's a fascinating look into how a government tries to regulate these essential services.
Absolutely. But here's a final thought for you, dear listener. This move towards ex ante capex review. It signals a shift in regulatory thinking, a more proactive approach focused on ensuring cost efficiency from the very beginning. What could this mean for future infrastructure projects in Abu Dhabi? Could this model be applied to other sectors? Food for thought. And if you're hungry for more, be sure to check out the show notes for additional resources. Until next time, stay curious.